ask them, okay, so what kind of things are printed on paper? And they kind of stare at me for a minute. And then somebody will go, legal documents. Yep. Newspapers. Yep. Uh, wills. That's a legal document. But I mean, all kinds of stuff. Broadsides, which are posters that they would just put up on fences or on trees, things like that, to announce things. But it wasn't even just that. Even playing cards, because they're made out of paper, right? Dice. I don't know. I don't think dice would have been made out of paper, but dice were included in that. So by taxing paper, the British government is offending everybody pretty much. It's not just the rich, not just the poor. It's everybody. Just if you use paper, you're offended. So printers, think about printers. Printers, when they get mad, what do? They write editorials condemning the rulers and stirring up the people. Lawyers, what do? Well, they sue you. Gamblers, okay, so these are rowdy people that go out in the streets and start brawls and things like that. So way to go, Britain. You really did a great job here. You offended everybody. It hurt Americans from all walks of life. And the colonial governments and the colonists, they highly resented this act because they were used to governing their own affairs, as we mentioned earlier. Many condemned the act, and they didn't just give speeches, and they didn't just print nasty editorials. They didn't do Twitter storms and things like that. They started forming mobs and going around and enforcing or canceling the enforcement of the law, enforcing that it would not be enforced. For example, this happened in a lot of places, but I'll point out one of the most famous episodes. On August 14th, 1765, a mob wrecked the house of the Massachusetts stamp officer, Andrew Oliver. They surrounded this guy and they said, you might not want to do this. You might want to look for work elsewhere. Maybe you need a new job. And he kind of looked at him and said, yeah, I think you're right. So he resigns. They attacked the governor's house. They messed up the house and ransacked at the house of Governor Thomas Hutchinson, acting governor at that time. James Otis, who we mentioned earlier, he issued a call for a colonial conference. And so this meeting, which occurred in October of 1765, it becomes known as the Stamp Act Congress. And again, not the first Congress. We'd had the Albany Congress, but this is more organized, more colonies are represented. It issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which becomes a very famous document explaining to Britain that we don't like your taxes and we'll tax ourselves. Thank you very much. And by the time the Stamp Act was set to go into effect, there was not a single stamp agent in the colonies willing to enforce it. So this is an example of mob rule. And the founders later on, when they write the Constitution, they're not going to forget about this. And they're going to put measures into the Constitution to try to prevent this from happening later on. In other words, just mobs going around and threatening the lives of the governing officials and telling them you can't enforce the law. The opposition to the Stamp Act brought down Grenville's government, so the British government collapses, and the succeeding government very smartly and wisely repealed the act, and in 1766, William Pitt again became prime minister. Pitt had been the prime minister during part of the French and Indian War, the latter part, and he had really turned it around. At the beginning of the French and Indian War, Britain was losing badly. They were getting their butts kicked, but once William Pitt took command of the government, he turned things around, spent more money, put better leaders down. But then he had resigned, but now he's back, although he's very sick. And so we'll see he's not going to be able to govern very well.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. One thought that I had in mind, and this is something to keep in mind as we look at these different acts, where you think this is a foreign government that's directly meddling in the domestic economy of another land. And you're right, that's exactly what's happening. That's because Britain is an empire and America is a colony. And this is a good way to understand globally what happens to colonies around the world, where that is what a colony is, where its economic affairs are directly meddled in by the central power to greater or lesser extents, where you would have colonies in Africa, for example, where the level of direct control could be very, very high by the French or British. So the whole study of how colonies operated from a model This continues on really until about the 1960s when the final colonies disappear. Very short book plug. There's a book by Niall Ferguson called Empire, The Rise and Demise of the British World Order and Lessons for Global Power. He basically argues that empires were in many ways not better or worse than other things because they're staffed by humans and humans do good and bad things. But anyway, this is just, as James is talking about this, you can get a little glimpse into just simply how empires operate.
Oh, that sounds interesting. I've never read that book. I'll have to look into it. Okay, so the Stamp Act is strike two. Strike one was the Sugar Act. Strike two is the Stamp Act. So let's see what's going to happen on the next pitch. As I mentioned earlier, William Pitt was very ill, and he really wasn't able to fulfill his responsibilities as prime minister. So a lot of the power goes down to a man named Charles Townsend. Charles Townsend was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which in the British government is the money man. He's in control of the funds, the finances, roughly equivalent to the Secretary of the Treasury in the American government, which will come later. Townsend sponsors a new series of taxes. So the British government, they're not giving up on taxes. And of course, they're not happy about the rebellions against the Stamp Act. And so the British government is gradually getting more and more of an idea that we are going to force our will on you guys. We are the master. You guys are the servants. We're the empire. You're the colony. You know, the Americans were saying, well, but we've always run our own affairs. We've always run our own financial and even political affairs. And the British responded by, well, okay, maybe that's true, but not anymore. Anyway, Townsend sponsored a new set of acts only on goods imported into the colonies. He wanted to avoid the backlash against the Stamp Act. So only imports, not just everything sold within the colonies. He targeted things like paper, and there's paper again, but less paper is taxed this time, glass, silk, paint, and tea. Colonists responded by vowing to not import any goods from Britain. So there was a non-importation act. It was hard to enforce. Not all the colonists were on board with it, but it did kind of hurt a little bit, at least in Britain. More importantly, the Massachusetts legislature printed a circular letter, which was written by Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams, we haven't introduced him yet, but Samuel Adams is one of the earliest and most radical leaders of the anti-government, anti-British government people in America. We'll call them patriots. We don't, by patriots, we're not necessarily saying they're the good guys and the others are the bad guys, but that's just we'll use it as a technical term. A patriot. We don't mean it in the sense of, oh, this is a man who loves his country. We're using it in the sense of an American colonist who was opposed to British policy. How about that? Does that seem reasonable, Scott?
That sounds reasonable. I think we'll go with that.
Also not the football team. But
yeah, no Tom Brady.
Oh, please. Don't get me started on that. But anyway, so Samuel Adams wrote this letter, and the legislature of Massachusetts endorsed it and sent it around to other colonies, and they condemned the new acts. And again, it was spread around through the colonies. So we're starting to see communication between the different colonies. The Massachusetts governor, Francis Bernard, was ordered to dissolve the legislature if they would not take the letter back. They refused, and the governor dissolved them. But they just went and took up business elsewhere. In 1768, and this is major, 2 British infantry regiments were sent to Boston to keep order, quote unquote, keep order. They harassed Bostonians in a variety of ways. The Bostonians, in turn, constantly taunted the soldiers. So these are the famous British regulars, the redcoats, lobsterbacks, as some of the patriots called them. This is a major change, Scott, because prior to this, the British government, other than the French and Indian War, of course, they sent regular troops to fight the French. But other than that, the British government had not sent regular army troops to the colonies, and it's especially not for the purpose of keeping an eye on them. So remember, these are their own people. They're all British citizens, and yet they're sending over these British troops to basically be like police to make sure that Boston doesn't do the people of Boston and the surrounding area don't do anything crazy. They don't want any more examples of the government, the governor's house being ransacked or people's being threatened with their lives and things like that. But again, it raises the tension level even higher. There's so much conflict, and we don't have time to go into all the reasons why, but suffice it to say that the Redcoats did not like the people of Boston, and the people of Boston did not like the Redcoats.
I mean, it sounds like something is going to happen in Boston. I mean, it could be a kerfuffle. It could be maybe something even worse. I don't know. A decimation? Is something bad going to happen in Boston?
It just might. This is a recipe for disaster. It's almost like throwing a match on a smoldering bunch of greasy rags or something. So it takes a while, but 2 years later in 1770, a street fight broke out between a British soldier and a Bostonian. That wasn't obviously the first time there were fights a lot, but
it's Boston. I mean, come on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, anyway, I'm not going to, I don't want to, if you're living in Boston, we're not anti-Boston. Okay. So don't get mad at us. But at the time, the people of Boston were the most radical people in the colonies. And so this fight breaks out between a British soldier and a resident of Boston, and a British Guard unit comes out to try to see what's going on, maybe try to break it up. The captain of the guard ordered the crowd to disperse, but of course they don't do it, right? The people of Boston don't take orders from British soldiers. Instead, the crowd gets bigger and they begin throwing things at the soldiers. They throw snowballs, they throw oyster shells, they throw sticks. I've heard that even they threw big pieces of wood, even like a club. One of the British soldiers was hit by a club, and he raised his musket, and the musket went off. And to this day, we don't know exactly what happened. Did he just fire out of anger, or was he just in a situation where he was nervous, he was tense, he had an itchy trigger finger, and if you get hit on the head, you tend to react, right? So but what we do know is that the other soldiers fired into the crowd. 3 Bostonians were killed immediately. 2 or 3 more, depends on your source, died later of their wounds. And the incident confirmed the colonists' suspicion that the British were out to get the colonists. And this is what, of course, became known as the Boston Massacre. And the people of Boston, or at least the writers and even Paul Revere. Paul Revere was, of course, we know him as a silversmith and the guy who did Paul Revere's Ride, which we'll talk about later. But Paul Revere was also a talented artist. He drew up a famous picture of this. Maybe we can get it on the website eventually, Scott, but he drew a famous drawing which makes it look like the evil British are firing cruelly upon the crowd. And he makes it look like the captain who was in charge of the unit ordered this. It's like he said, just fire on them. That turned out to not be true, but as we know from history, it's not always what really happened that is important, but what was perceived to have happened. And what happened next is interesting. The soldiers who fired into the crowd were tried by a local court for murder. And when it was time to find a lawyer to defend these soldiers, almost nobody would do it, but they finally persuaded a young man, 35 years old, named John Adams, to be their attorney and to defend them. And John Adams did such a great job, he got them acquitted. I think a couple of them were maybe convicted of manslaughter or something like that. I've read so much I forget all the details, but I know that they wanted, some of them were on trial for murder and they did not get convicted of murder. So there's John Adams. This is his first moment of fame and glory, and he's going to have a big future ahead of him.
Very well depicted in the book, of course, but also the John Adams miniseries on HBO with Paul Giamatti in the lead. And this is a cornerstone event when people talk about rights of the accused, that the John Adams defending of the Boston Massacre is brought up. Doesn't make him a popular figure at that time. Things are heating up, as you said. So definitely. And
like you said, he was not popular, but he said everybody's entitled to a fair defense.
Right.
This is not the Salem witch trials where we just say, oh, you're a witch, we're going to hang you. Here, go over here. But things are different, like we said. All right. So things actually, believe it or not, after that, calmed down for quite a while, and things were fairly stable for about 3 years. But then now we got to do some economics.
Yeah.
Let's go back to Britain. The British East India Company was this huge corporation that had a monopoly on the tea trade. They would bring tea over from the East and sell it in Britain and other parts of the British Empire and even to other countries. But they were about to go bankrupt. Now, the prime minister by now is a man named Lord North. We're going